we can develop the skills we need. We can develop the processes we need. And so there's not a magic formula to this. There's not a secret sauce. It's really about having the commitment to take your organization into the 21st century and into this digital world. How much of the story of digital transformation in organizations is about technology? Well, in some senses, all of it, because it's what brings us to this situation. And on the other side, it's none of it. It's more about how the organizations learn to adapt to these new business environments and these new business challenges and the pace of doing business. It's not really about the technology first and foremost. It's the business model that is outdated. It's not necessarily the technology that is, although it may be, but getting that first things first is what's important.
That should be plastered all over the book. Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Weeks. Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. What allows some organizations and individuals to thrive in the new world of rapid technology innovation and the subsequent disruption, while others fall behind or get stuck in obsolescence? Have you ever wondered or maybe worried about how your company is going to catch up to the digital train that's left the station, or take on new technologies that seem everywhere, but your company or you haven't adopted yet? I'm exploring these questions today with my guest, Gerald Kane. Gerald is an expert in this area. He's the professor of information systems at Boston College, the Carroll School of Management. And after a 6-year study into how digital technologies have disrupted companies of all sizes, Jerry highlights the key findings in his newly released book, The Technology Fallacy: How People Are the Real Key to Digital Transformation. There were thousands of interviews with employees and employers in this research, and they drove some fascinating findings that are outlined in the book, and it's the topic of our podcast. Jerry was a great interview, and not only was he generous with his findings, but very passionate about them. Let me alert those of you in a couple of buckets here. If you're an executive running a company, or maybe a CDO, chief digital or something, or you're just in charge of digital transformation for your company, or let's just say you're an employee who wants to keep pace with change. You just want to stay relevant in the workplace, or maybe you feel a bit unprepared for the innovations that you're seeing coming, so on and so forth. Listen to this show and read Jerry's book, Run, Don't Walk. To get a copy, let me change it. What do I say now? Download, don't ship, whatever. Get the book. This conversation goes by quickly just because of Jerry's passion, and we kind of get into the meat of things right away. But we talk about many things. We talk a lot about the research. I actually go over some of the survey data that he has in the book that I think you'll find interesting. But we also talk about adapting technology, adapting to disruption, and how Jerry says it isn't actually all about the technology. And we kind of back into the data that kind of shows that. And it's actually the heart of the technology fallacy, I think. And then we talk about some of the things that are fundamental and that make a difference, mindset being one of them. And he goes into some of that research. And then we talk about the similar characteristics that companies have that are thriving through digital disruption. It gives you some examples. The importance of culture. Here we are again with culture. But what does that mean? And we kind of walk through that. We talk about agile project management. We talk about silos versus cross-functional teams, the importance of experimentation. And we talk about the age factor. If you're an older person in the workplace, you'll find this interesting, how succeeding in the digital era is really not about age. We talk about how to develop employees for long-term success. How do you prepare in an era of rapid change? And then again, we give some examples of how companies are doing that, from manufacturers to healthcare, so just a variety. We actually go through kind of where industries are, and he has a kind of a score that he calls digital maturity, that we look at which companies are digitally mature, approaching digital maturity, and what are the laggards. And also, I'll say this was incredibly encouraging, and I think you'll find it encouraging because there's much about the coming disruptions and innovations that we don't know. They're unknown. But there's a way you can still prepare, not only individually, but as a company for them. So without further ado, here's Gerald Kane. Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to talk to you. You have a lot of data in your book, and you're also currently teaching at Carroll School of Management.
Yeah, so I wear two hats as far as this is concerned. First, I am a professor of information systems at Boston College's Carroll School of Management, where I've been teaching about digital disruption and technology for managers since about 2006. And then for this research, I have a hat as the guest editor for digital business at MIT Sloan Management Review, where we conducted really a 6-year research project involving how legacy companies were really adapting to digital disruption. And the book is the outcome of that research thread. So I teach it and I study it.
Has anybody done such a study before or gathered this type of information?
I think there's a lot. I don't know the answer to that question. I do know we've gotten really good responses. And I'm sure there are other people out there doing similar stuff, but I think we're pretty unique with the scope of the data collection combined with the interviews. We've been able to interview over 100 executives and thought leaders who are actually on the ground doing this. And then combined with sort of my academic expertise on this topic. And I should say our research sponsors for this are Deloitte. So they bring the practical expertise. And so we're really able to bring, I think, together a number of different forces to create a number of different sources of data to create a whole that's really much stronger than the sum of its parts.
So let me get into it. And the book is called The Technology Fallacy: How People Are the Real Key to Digital Transformation.
It's funny, we come up with the title for the book last, and it's only now that I've been talking about it that I really sort of understand what the title means in relation to our research. And I'm working on a piece that sort of articulates that now. And I really define the technology fallacy as the mistaken belief that just because the causes of business disruption are digital, that necessarily the solution to that disruption is also digital. And in fact, we're finding that many of the more challenging aspects are the organizational changes that need to take place to get companies more agile, more responsive, more adaptive. And those things are around leadership and talent and culture and strategy and organizational structure. And many people aren't talking about that. And so I actually think those responses are one at least as important as the technology, and one that most organizations just aren't giving enough attention to.
And it's a positive message. I'm not saying there's certainly going to be some disempowering issues when it comes to disruption, but it can be more will than skill. And specifically, your data is showing that for an organization to successfully navigate the disruption that's coming digitally, it's more about people and specifically more about the mindset of the people more than anything technological. Is that right?
Yes, it really is a mindset shift. And we rely a lot on the work by Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist, who talks about the difference between fixed mindset and growth mindset in people. And we think this needs to be applied to the organizational level as well. So for a fixed mindset, it's people believe that skills are innate or they're born with them. And they tend to sort of attribute success or failure to sort of the external environment. Whereas growth mindset people feel that skills can be developed over time, and success or failure is really a result of the effort and work you put into things. And we hear this for companies all the time, particularly traditional companies, that I'm not a digital person or we're not a digital company. That's a very fixed mindset approach. Whereas most of our research shows that the companies that are getting it right are those that say, we can develop the skills we need. We can develop the processes we need. And so there's not a magic formula to this. There's not a secret sauce. It's really about having the commitment to take your organization into, the 21st century and into this digital world, because I don't think there's any going back. We use I'm proud of the metaphor we use. In the book, it's related to the Wizard of Oz. And we say, how much of the Wizard of Oz, the story of the Wizard of Oz is about the cyclone? On one hand, all of it is, because the story wouldn't have happened if the cyclone didn't come and take Dorothy to Oz. On the other hand, none of it is, because we don't really care about the cyclone. We care about Dorothy's adventure through this new and strange world. Likewise, that's the role of technology in digital disruption. how much of the story of digital transformation in organizations is about technology? Well, in some senses, all of it, because it's what brings us to this situation. And on the other side, it's none of it. It's more about how the organizations learn to adapt to these new business environments and these new business challenges and the pace of doing business. It's not really about the technology first and foremost. It's about those business challenges.
I think there may be some fear that people have. I'm not going to be able to keep up or what have you. Part of my worry out there is the news cycles and Congress and what have you. It can tend to scare people as that we're victims of change versus people who are growing with and just adapting to what's coming.
Yep.
Was it Schumpeter? He talked about creative destruction is fundamental to economic growth. In other words, if we all want to grow, if we all want to get to the next stage of whatever the country or the economy is going to get to, then disruption has to happen. Is that missing or forgotten because of the pace of the change?
Yeah. So when we actually did, I think one of the hallmarks of our survey research, so we were able to interview or survey about 20,000 people globally over the 5 years of this particular research segment. And we actually, each year we asked an open text question. We just said, and the one we're referring to is I said, okay, how is digital business different than traditional business? And I gave them a big blank box and asked them to fill it in. And then I had research assistants go through and categorize all the responses. And the biggest difference was pace of change. Was in some senses, it's not that it's that much of different from what we've dealt with in the past. It's all just going so much faster. And that is a challenge because without the creation part, it's just destruction and disruption. But part of what when I speak to audiences, I put a little bit of the cheerleader hat on because I think that comes from this belief that I'm not a technological person, that I can't do this stuff. And a lot of our research pretty much shows that what it takes to keep up isn't as much about coding and AI, algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. It's about being change-oriented. It's about being forward-looking. And it's about being willing to continue to develop your skills in this new world. And by and large, at least in our surveys, people want to do this. So we asked people, to what extent is your organization going to be disrupted as a result of these trends? And 87% said, yes, our industry is going to be disrupted. And then when we asked a follow-up question, is your organization doing enough to respond to it? Only 44% that said that their organization was doing enough. So there's this huge gap. People see it's happening and organizations aren't changing fast enough.
So you have some great data, and you have this one chart I'm looking at, industries born of technology lead the sectors with the greatest penetration of digital maturing organizations. That makes sense. IT, telecom, media, entertainment.
Yep.
And they say, however, this year's, I'm assuming 2019, digital business study did find a consistent set of laggards on the opposite end of the spectrum. And it looks like the laggards, so obviously the leaders, IT, technology, and then we start getting into transportation, tourism, retail, auto, pharma, consumer goods, FSI, insurance, oil and gas, healthcare. That surprised me. Healthcare and manufacturing, public sector. That doesn't surprise me. And so is it two things? They're not currently using what's available to some extent, possibly, and or not ready for. Obviously, there's more to come.
Well, I think the message of that chart was, okay, there's some clear leaders, technology, media, telecom. And over the 5 years of research, we see those as being clear leaders consistently. As far as the laggards go, in general, they may lag. But each of those bottom dwellers, if you like, or the lagging industries, actually had moments of bright spots. In fact, I had a student in my class who works in the construction industry just come and give a presentation about how his company was attempting to use AI to enforce OSHA compliance and really improve safety and the business case for that. So you do have, although you have leaders and laggards, I think it's a mistake to say that the leaders are doing everything perfectly, because I think there are plenty of tech companies, plenty of telecom companies that have areas to grow. And the ones that are doing it are continually trying to stay ahead. One of the themes has been those who are leading recognize that the goal is a moving target, and it's the new normal is adapting to this stuff. It's not like you're going to become transformed and then okay, we're done. Technology is going to keep changing, and it's about learning to adapt to this state of constant change. But even those laggards and the stories that really I think were most interesting to me in this research were those stories in the industries that you didn't expect them. Were in insurance, were in construction, were in healthcare, were in retail, and how some of those companies like Walmart and John Hancock were really making some interesting strides and were really doing some stuff right. And if I had to have a takeaway of the change over the 5 years of research, was that those legacy companies really are in the process of waking up and realizing they need to do something, and actually doing some really great, bold, aggressive stuff. And so those are the stories that I think were most interesting to me.
And they were probably pushed by the new entrants to those businesses who were digital first, right? Amazon pushed Walmart. And then now I see it in finance, right? Where there's no legacy. They're coming in just as digital. So let's define digital transformation or catch up or the actual innovation. Do you know what areas companies are lagging in? I'm going to take a stab that it's maybe on the customer centric side, but I don't know.
Yeah. So, you've brought us back into a technology focused discussion. And so if I would define digital transformation, it's adapting your organization to the current digital environment. That adaptation may or may not involve technology at all. Where we're seeing companies, legacy companies in particular, struggle more, is we actually have in the last chapter of the book, there's a very practical takeaway, a survey that you can do in your own company to assess your digital maturity and the areas that you need to work on as a company. And so I just wanted to sort of get that plug in there, that there is a how-to element of this that can be done. Where we see the companies struggle are things like risk tolerance, are things like experimentation, are things like iteration. We see that one thing that surprised me is we asked, this goes back to one of the charts, digitally mature companies are more likely to organize according to cross-functional teams than less mature companies. And when we asked around, when I asked respondents this, the CIO of Harley-Davidson said, if we don't organize cross-functionally, digital is impacting every aspect of our product. If we don't integrate digital cross-functionally, we are never going to actually have an integrated product.
So there's silos or something there?
Yeah, and so silos is a huge thing that companies are wrestling with. Freddie Mac, one of the VPs we interviewed there, said, if we don't organize differently, we won't ever think differently. And then CarMax, we interviewed the CIO of CarMax, and he said, we organize according to cross-functional teams because it allows us to be more experimental. It allows us to task these project teams with different initiatives and try different things and see what works. And so those are the things I think that companies are wrestling with more. We can talk all we want about AI or cloud or whatever. If you have the great technologies, but outdated organizational structure, culture, decision-making, experimentation, et cetera, the technologies will be great, but it's not going to get your organization to where it wants to go. And so sort of the key message of this book is let's not focus just on the shiny new objects that are out there. Let's make sure we get the blocking and the tackling right. Let's make sure we get the basics right. So even when these technologies are in place, that we can make sure we can take advantage of them as a business. Because even a perfectly implemented technology solution isn't going to help if the silos still keep you from working effectively together.
So this is in part cultural. In other words, a cultural kind of shift to be either more flat or more open. Yep. It was interesting that you talked about the death of Six Sigma, and or at least how disruption is kind of killing Six Sigma because Six Sigma is too slow. It's focused maybe on quality assurances and things of that nature, and experimentation is not a consideration.
Right. Six Sigma is really great in conditions where the environment is well known and the
or specific industries. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Ingredients or something. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't work as well where you need to adapt and experiment and innovate, because you just can't keep whatever 3 parts per million error rate and be trying new things. And GE knows this, and GE has implemented something called FastWorks, which is they're not abandoning Six Sigma. They're just also recognizing that they need more tools in their toolbox to be able to adapt to a digital world. And of course, GE is a problematic example because they're struggling on a number of levels. But I think it has little to do with their digital transformation aspects.
Yeah, at Google, if you're putting something into a product, the code is, talk about QA. It's, you have to be very, 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 very careful. So they have teams, I had a team of, we kind of called them ninjas, where these engineers would prototype something for me, and it didn't necessarily live in product. So we could release something either internally or in a limited capacity, client facing, right away. We could figure out what's and iterate. But if we were going to put it into product, that took much longer. In other words, there were a lot more QA had to go into and look in the code and what have you. But it was an interesting way, because when you prototype, put something out there, you could figure out, is there demand? Is it what we wanted? Can we change the features? And that can happen very rapidly. And then once you've got all this information, you could send it over to product, which then it becomes a more, slower process. And
codified, stable. Absolutely. And so I interviewed Richard Gingras at Google. I don't know if you knew him. He's the VP of Google News, and he did the AMP, accelerated mobile pages and such like that. And what impressed me about Google is this focus on experimentation? And he said, we're running 1,000 different experiments every day, and it almost doesn't matter. We don't really even care if they're successful or not, as long as we are learning something. And that attitude is so foreign to traditional legacy companies. Have a fail. We got to plan. We got to do a waterfall method. We got to plan everything out to make it perfect before we even think about taking that next step or that first step. And that just doesn't work in today's digital world, when we need to try lots of different things, learn, and move forward. Now, one of the really interesting things in our research. So I had this working hypothesis that digitally mature companies were going to be more experimental, and we actually didn't find that. What we found, so everybody experiments. What we found was that digitally mature companies were more likely to take the results of that experiment to drive change across the organization. Everybody has a Silicon Valley innovation lab. Everybody has sort of an area where they say, look, this is the area we're innovating over there. But the rules are, but just don't touch our core business. Just don't bring it back in. You can innovate all you want in your little sandbox. Don't mess with the core business. And the companies that are getting it right are taking the innovations that they have and using that to drive change across the organization, to develop new lines of business, new improvements, et cetera, et cetera. So I came into this team. They'd already been working together for a little while when I became the academic lead. And the consultants had this 3-stage model where they said, okay, companies, we had early stage, we have developing stage, we have maturing stage. And once I'd built some, cred in my team, I said, this just sounds too consultancy to me. And we haven't really proven it out. What I'd like to do is do a cultural index of these companies so we can come up with, what are the different paths to digital maturity? Because I envisioned, that there would be sort of like these different archetypes of digital companies. Because if you look, Google's different than Apple, Apple's different than Facebook, culturally. So, like, what are the different cultures? So we did this index. We did not include our maturity index or our maturity measure at all in our analysis. And we did something called cluster analysis. And when we got the results back, it was simultaneously the most encouraging and discouraging result I got in all 5 years of my research with them. And that was, maturity metric aside, the cluster analysis, which basically just groups these responses based on the data, came back that there were 3 clusters, not 4, not 6, not 2, and they were pretty much 90% correlated with our early developing maturing framework. So I couldn't say there were different paths to digital maturity. Our data said there was one path, and that was developing these set of cultural characteristics, which involved more agile, being more collaborative, being more risk tolerant, being more experimental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do think culture is a really critical part of this process, technology aside. And when people ask me where to start, I often say, look, start with the culture. Everybody needs to move there. And in fact, the digitally maturing companies are also more likely to report increasing their efforts to develop these cultural characteristics.
Let's talk about the individual, if that's okay. How people can succeed in this time of either digital disruption or transformation. You have a chart in here on the most important skills that an employee should have to succeed in a digital workplace. And by the way, who did you ask for this particular one? Who was asked this question?
Yeah, so all 4,500 respondents that year. And I believe that one was another one of our open text questions where we just said, what skills do employees need? And we left an open box. And then they just responded.
But is it could be executives, HR people, employees?
Yeah, so it's all range of, we had CEOs, we had, and CEOs of smaller companies, and directors and VPs. I don't exactly have the breakdown in front of me, but it's a wide range.
So the most important skills, at least the feedback in the survey here, was the top two was change, and it looks like technological literacy understanding. And in your book, you say that companies are looking for a balance of hard and soft skills, not only technical but business skills in the same person.
Yes, I mean, obviously, if it depends a little bit on your company and your role, but really people who, and when we say technical skills, I think it's important to emphasize it's really digital literacy. They don't necessarily need, I mean, they always need more coders, but they also need people who can talk to the coders and execute a business plan on top of it. So when we're talking tech skills, you don't need Hadoop or to be able to program the machine learning algorithm, but having sort of a functional and conversational knowledge of what these technologies can do is critical. But if you do that and you aren't willing to keep learning, so another one of the key takeaways for managers and employees, or leaders and employees, I should say, is the need for continual learning. In the book, we ask, how often do you need to update your skill set to compete in a digital world, to operate? And something like 90% of our respondents said we need to update our skill set at least yearly. And that's important to say, it's not just training. What people want more of is on-the-job learning, moving around to different projects, learning new functions, learning learning new ways of working. And it's that continual learning that I think is really the key to surviving and succeeding in your career in this digital world. And in fact, there's a really great result in our research that said people of all ages, and so one of the things that we dispel is this is just young people wanting this, want to work for digitally mature companies. They report being much more likely to leave their company if they're working for an early stage company than a later one. But if these companies provide the opportunities for employees to continue developing their skill sets, that difference is almost entirely erased. So what it is people want to make sure they're viable on the job market. They want to know, when you're working for your company, do they have the ability to keep growing their skill set so when the time comes to move on, that they're going to be marketable? And so providing employees with those opportunities are really critical, not only for retaining the talent you want, but also making sure you can attract new talent and you have those digital capabilities that are going to propel your organization into the next 20 years.
Yeah, to me that's critical. You also, in your book, you say that one reason being a kind of change-oriented person or a lifelong learner is important is that you're seeing unprecedented rapid skill deterioration. You said that one digital leader of a Fortune 500 company indicated that the expertise half-life runs about 10 to 12 years. So if you learn something, let's say you were in sales and you left sales, you came back 10 or 12 years later, half of what you knew could still be in use, and only half of what you knew would be in use in that job. But in the digital era, the half-life is closer to 18 months because everything changes so fast. So when I first joined Google, I was tasked. I needed to build. We had this new program we were ramping, and I had to build out an internal training area that people could reference, that could go to, like an internal wiki of sorts, right? And it had its own web address within Google. But when I first got there, I was just looking for research that Google had in certain areas, and they had all these wikis. It was like a graveyard. They were not updated. There were just hundreds and hundreds of these resources. I'm like, what is going on? And then I created this wiki. And a year later, I put a ton of work in it. Half of it was out of date. It just, and I realized now I know why. This is just, it's good for 18 months or so, but it's just tough to keep on top of. The change is just constant.
Yes. And that was I wasn't allowed to say it in the book because of my various risk people, but the example you cited was from Marriott. And they've been doing a lot to sort of update because they're under threat from, Airbnb. Who would have thought smartphones and platforms would disrupt the hotel industry? And here we are. And what they're doing, but they've got a great strategy of catering to particular segment of customers and making their experience more digitally fluid. But he had a great example there. And this goes back to that cross-functional team aspect. His digital area developed like a really great app that you could do a bunch of stuff on. Order room service, get into unlock your room, et cetera, check in. But oftentimes the local hotel operations weren't supporting it, and so you'd order a room service and it would go to nowhere, and people would just get pissed off. So the best digital app without those operational processes that support it isn't going to work real well. And so he said the next step was getting operations involved. So they figured out how to integrate it because digital really does span the whole organization. And unless you think of it holistically, you're going to have these disconnects that really affect your operation.
It was interesting in the book. I think the point was made that hiring by age just for the tech savviness is a mistake.
Yes. So, I hear all over the place that, we got to be prepared for millennials. We got to be, update our, and nowhere in our data do we ever find that age is a significant, I don't want to use significant, is a meaningful predictor of any of these trends or any of these perceptions. So some of it may be, yes, we're affiliated with MIT, so we may have a little bit of a sampling bias going on. But this is also true of my anecdotal experience, is there are plenty of growth, learning, digitally minded older people out there. And if you bring a young person in out of college and put them in an outdated organizational structure where they can't continue to developing their skill set, they're going to be obsolete in 5 years. And so what I tell my students, in fact, in the class is called Emerging Technologies in Digital Business. Anything I can teach them is going to be obsolete in 5 years. So what I try to do is show them how to go. So I say we drink the Kool-Aid in this class. We're going to experiment with new methods of learning and new approaches to pedagogy. And because I say what I can teach you is how to keep learning and keep developing these skill sets. And by and large, I think we're pretty successful. One of my colleagues, senior colleagues, sat in on it. He said it was the first truly 21st century course he'd ever experienced. And so if you hire millennials or new college students for their tech skills, but don't put them in a place where they can continue developing their skills, they're going to be obsolete in 5 years. And so that seems like a terrible strategy. And in fact, our data suggests that the companies with there's some interesting charts about, do you have enough talent in your company? Everybody reports wanting more talent. And the companies that are more likely to say we have enough or we're in good shape are those, not the ones that keep hiring new talent, but those that are developing the skill sets of their own employees. So I guarantee there are people in everybody's organizations that want to keep learning, and the organization's holding them back. And there's some really interesting examples. For instance, I believe it was Aetna, the insurer, who has a HR development strategy where they've got your traditional tuition reimbursement program. But if you are willing to go back and but they've identified what are 15 strategic areas that the company is going to need skill sets to grow. If you get a degree in one of those skill sets, they'll reimburse you at 3 times the normal rate. And they find that those employees are more likely to stay. And the ROI of that investment, they worked with a consulting company to set that up, is in the order of 100 to 150%. So developing their own employees is particularly critical. At the same time, all of our executives said, there are going to be some people that are always resistant and don't want to continue developing and learning. And you need to either be prepared to move them to a part of the organization where that's not going to matter, or move them out of the organization, because you just can't have those people holding things up, being the barriers to the growth you need.
I thought it was interesting. The book, you talk about younger students tend to excel in the procedural applications of technology. That is, they're good at navigating the apps platforms. Older students, however, tend to be superior in the strategic applications of technology. This is a broad brush, but still, older students tend to be superior in the strategic applications. And then once they're familiar with the capabilities of the technology, they appreciate the business applications more quickly than the younger students. So those of you who are older out there, use it to your advantage. By the way, you said the course that you teach, emerging technologies in digital.
Yeah, emerging technologies and digital business. The course title has evolved over the 9-10 years that I've taught it too. It used to be social media and digital business, or it used to be social media for managers, then social media and digital business, then emerging technologies and digital business. Because as blockchain and AI and data and analytics have all come up on board, it's hard to talk about these technologies in isolation of each other.
Yeah, this has got to be a popular course.
Yeah, it's fun, and it's I also teach it. So you're talking about procedural versus strategic. It's a hybrid undergrad MBA course. So undergrads and MBAs are in the same classroom, because I find that interactive discussion is much better than if you have those two groups separate. And I think it's a metaphor for organizations, is make sure the older and the younger people are having these conversations to exchange knowledge.
Is this campus only, or is this online, or is this something?
Yeah, currently it's campus only. Now, more of it happens online than offline, which is interesting, but we do sort of meet traditionally. Where I've had a lot of luck lately, and not trying to put in a plug, it is less about offering a class and more about going into an organization and working with their leaders.
Oh, that's great.
3 months or for a year, once a month, just to sort of get them up to speed. Because what happens if you train one person and get them to digital literacy, that's great. But they're having to go in then and champion and share everything they learned and educate people, as well as try to push an agenda. If you educate all of your leaders, if you educate all your leaders at once, then you're developing a shared digital literacy, and together you can begin to figure out what's possible. 2 things about that. First, is so my academic research is on this area too, sort of organizational learning. And one of my first research papers, it's about 10 years old now, but I think the findings still apply, is just a certain amount of that exploration, of just a small amount of that new knowledge can really go a long way to moving the organization to where it needs to go. So you're not talking about a rehab project. You're talking about just making sure these people are having these conversations with one another once a month. Then another exercise that I often do with executives is what I call absurdly long-term strategic planning, where we do a strategic plan for a 10 to 20-year time frame for the organization. And when I first suggest that, everybody thinks I'm just absolutely crazy. How can we possibly do this? But what we do is we go through okay, let's assume in 10 years autonomous vehicles are going to be mainstream. What are going to be the industry applications for these sorts of things? And as we go through that thought process, you realize what a massive ripple effect that will have on multiple areas of the economy. And so not only do we teach them about it, but then when we go through that, we recognize, whoa, if you look 10 to 20 years out, the strategic implications are going to be massive. And our little efforts right now are nowhere near enough to get us ready for that future. So even if you don't get it right, it sort of helps you get started in the right direction and start taking big enough steps and start thinking boldly enough. And so that's a very valuable, if you have that aha moment together, it's much easier to sort of take those next steps that need to follow.
If I'm a manufacturing company and I don't know where to start. I know I need to be digitally mature. I don't know if I am. I want to be prepared for the future. You have an audit in the book. Is that going to pinpoint where I should start? Or
Well, I think the audit can be done two ways. The easy way is to get your executives together and survey them on where you think your organization is. I think a far more effective way is to actually survey the entire organization, because one theme in our research is that senior leadership is often much more optimistic about where the company is than lower level employees. So they tend to have a rosier view of where things are. And we could talk an hour about why that's the case. And then what we recommend is take 3 to 5 areas that you think is going to be, frankly, the best ROI. Some of that may be, what are the biggest barriers? And if you could remove these barriers, they could really open up a lot of change opportunity. So it's bang for the buck. It's start small. It's what can you do in a 6 to 8 week time frame that will meaningfully move the needle on one of these 23 areas that you identified, and work on that. And then at the end of that 6 to 8 week period, evaluate it. If it didn't work, what did you learn from it? If it did work, what's your plan for using that to drive change across the organization? So it's a very just sort of baby steps approach. But if you don't make an intentional plan for that, it's never going to happen.
So let's talk about the future of work. So this came from a Deloitte CEO, is that right?
So we use data from a bunch of different people. The Deloitte CEO example is she likes to talk about work of the future as opposed to the future of work, because the premise is, yes, work will be here. We always have a need for work, and there's lots of different reasons why. But what will that work look like, and how do we prepare ourselves for that work of the future? And so we stuck with the terminology future of work because that's what people know. But I do like that sentiment of, it's work of the future. That's more optimistic.
So you're proposing in the book that when the technological disruption of human jobs happen, it's going to occur in 2 stages. First, augmentation and enhancing what people do, what the human worker can do, and then replacing people altogether in some specific jobs.
Certainly, there's a lot out there about the future of work right now. And I do believe not augmentation, but partnership is going to be the key. So if chess is an example I hear a lot. Originally, humans were the best chess players. Then when Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, computers were better chess players. Now it's actually human AI partnerships that are better. So it's human working with technologies. And I've heard in other things, AI will not replace doctors, like medical doctors, but doctors who use AI will replace doctors who don't. And so I think the future is ultimately about partnership, but we have to be prepared to adapt our partnership to where we can add value, and rather than, so I think if you think about autonomous vehicles, first, they're going to make drivers more efficient. So truckers are going to get much more work in, and they're going to make a lot more money in the short run until they're completely disrupted. And so what are the role of truckers going to be, and where can they add value? And I do think there are opportunities to add value. And so it's about constantly sort of keeping your finger on the pulse of the trends and figuring out what is the place that humans can add value? Because I do think there are certain areas, mainly in our ability to think creatively and to recognize opportunities created by technology disruption, is what we're really good at, because we're good at empathy for other people in ways that AI isn't. And we're also good at working with incomplete data, which AI isn't particularly good at. And so taking those two together leads us, I think it leads towards a much more entrepreneurial future where we learn how to add value to the existing technological infrastructure. There's a great example. David Artur, the MIT economist, notes that he has a great TED Talk, by the way, on this, that there are actually more bank tellers in the US than before the ATM was introduced. The trick is those bank tellers' jobs are now very different. They're more customer service oriented. They're more, they offer sort of certain decision-making skill sets and decision-making support, as opposed to just counting out the money like they used to do.
I thought it was interesting. I didn't know this, but in 1910, the most common job was a farm worker. It was 40% of the workforce. And in 2000, it was only 10% of the US workforce or something. I can't remember.
Yeah, and Artur has a nice follow-up to that. He said, it was 40%, now it's 2% of farm workers. And the point being that, if you asked that farmer in 1900 what they would be doing, they had no way of figuring that out. But that doesn't mean we didn't figure it out. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. Now, the other thing, and not to get political on you, he also notes that part of the reason they were able to succeed was the U.S. started the high school movement and took a bunch of kids out of the fields and decided to educate them. Which turned out to be a really great investment in America's future. And so, I think we will need to sort of rethink government programs as well for how do we make sure our workforce is educated, is adaptable to deal with this digital future.
The high school movement?
Yeah. So, in 1900, kids didn't go to high school because they were working in the fields. And so they got to, I'd refer you to him.
No, I didn't know this.
Yeah. And it was a conscious effort in, the 1940s, I assume related to World War II, sometime pegged to that you had more people going back. There was a conscious effort to have kids complete high school, and you had to, by law, you had to stay till 16, which wasn't in the case before that. And so, we began to put in the societal structures to support the type of education that we needed.
And back to something that you talked about earlier is that, people need to prepare to be lifelong learners. The only constant is going to be change. So there's going to be a lot of pivoting. There's going to be a lot of career paths that open up that don't exist right now. So you're a professor. What is the key to lifelong learning? And I know that's a difficult question.
Well, but it's not. We are in a golden age of education. Anybody who wants to learn machine learning or data analytics or coding or any number of things, there are so many resources online to do that. There's almost no excuse to not continue developing your skill sets. So it really is a mindset shift. It really is this recognition that, look, this is the cost of doing business these days. So one question is, will companies begin to provide these opportunities? And maybe it's just space. Maybe it's continuing education. What are how do we make sure that people keep updating their skills? Because this idea of getting into an organization, doing a job, sticking with that company or in that field for life is just not possible anymore. And so it really is this mindset shift where the people need to do this and the organizations need to support it. And maybe it's, hey, we carve out a half a day a week for people to keep learning their skills, or we do hackathons, or we do, whatever it is that we use to continue developing our skills, that make sure we carve places out for it. Because what I see a lot of companies doing, and I'm sorry if I'm on a bit of a soapbox here, they want to, so the Stanford business professor Jim March, who just passed away recently, just a luminary in our field, had this distinction between exploration and exploitation. Exploitation is making use of the resources and knowledges you have now. Exploration is about learning new skills and competencies for the future. And what he found was that exploitation led to better short-term results, but worse long-term results. Exploration led to worse short-term results as you were figuring things out, but better long-term results because you learned new ways of doing business. And the truth is we need this blend of both. We need to both explore and exploit. But what I see so many companies doing is just exploiting, just focusing on next quarter's bottom line. And when you ask these sorts of executives why, they attribute short-term, Wall Street expectations. And if you're going to be pushed around by Wall Street, you will never lead your company into a digital future because there's not enough long-term results. There's not enough you won't get to that long-term place you need to go. And the executives that I talk to, and there are plenty of executives of public companies that get it. Walmart was a great example. The CEO of Walmart worked with their board to say, hey, we need to make these investments. We need to make these changes. And And the board agreed, and they said, we know this might lead to some short-term impact, but we know we have to do it for the long run. And if a company like Walmart, Fortune 1, is saying we need to make changes or we might not be here in the future, I think all companies need to do this. And this is where I think leadership is critical, because having the courage to lead beyond your next quarter Wall Street earnings report is what needs to happen. And you need to have leaders to step up and do it and boards to be supportive of that. There ends my sermon. Sorry about that.
I actually think you address this in the book. I think you call it leading the target. And I want you to elaborate on this, but there was some kind of healthcare workshop, and they were making a mistake in strategic thinking by planning to adapt their organization to the digital infrastructure as it exists today. And they hadn't considered, by the time they finished the adaptation, it may be obsolete and they'd have to do something differently.
Well, that will impact. We did that 10-year strategic planning exercise, and they realized as they looked at how blockchain and artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles were going to radically reshape the healthcare infrastructure and the healthcare industry, them focusing on the next EMR functionality rollout was not going to be particularly helpful.
Were these hospitals or?
They were. It was a range. It was a workshop. So you had people representing hospitals, you had medical doctors, you had researchers, all of the above.
How did you get to leading the target?
Well, I mean, it became obvious. So when we looked at this 10-year frame, it became obvious to me. Whether anybody did anything about it or not is another story. But again, this is why I think it'd be great to have. That I really think companies need to take the time to step back and spend at least a half a day a month, or let's say half a day every 6 months, making sure they're thinking about this digital strategy and how their company needs to respond. Because if you don't have these conversations, you get stuck in this short-term incremental thinking when the change that is coming is much more radical and is much more disruptive. And so breaking out of that short-term thinking is probably the best thing that any company can do to adapt to this future.
Was there any specific conclusions as to what they need to get up to speed on at all?
No, I mean, and that wasn't the focus of it. The focus was, are we thinking in the right direction? Is this where our efforts need to be? And I'll have a good healthcare response. So I was interviewing a guy named John Glasser, who's the VP, I believe, of Cerner, one of the big medical IT companies. So I asked him, how do you do this? How do you think for this future? And what he says is try to come up with angles that are true in a number of different possible futures. So he said, for instance, show me a situation where having patients have better ownership of their own data is a bad thing. He said, I don't see that situation coming to pass. So focus on providing that capability. And how do we continue to drive change? And how do we change? How does that providing healthcare data to patients change the way doctors work, nurses work, patients interact, and focus on driving that type of change and the cultural shifts around that change, and then the others can be capable on top of it. And so just a much more aggressive push in that general direction, regardless of what the technology is. And that's why we wrote the book is, okay, and we're not saying technology is not important and API is not important and cloud's not important, but when that's all you're talking about and you're not also talking about the organizational and cultural and talent and leadership changes that need to be made. And let's also be clear, it's not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I'm not someone that comes in that says, we need to do business entirely differently as a result. What it is we need to sit down and figure out what needs to change and what doesn't, and make those changes we need to make, and preserve those things we need to preserve. And that's a much harder and more nuanced conversation than let's just throw everything out and buy this new technology platform. One executive I talked to, healthcare, a guy named John Halamka, who's the CIO of Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, said, well, how do you do? If I have one hero in this field, it's him. Because over 20 years, he's sort of helped his very traditional organization adapt. And I said, what's your secret? And he said, our secret is we have no money. So we can't just go out and buy the solution. We have to think about it in terms of this way of how do we sort of act innovatively within this digital infrastructure. And so sometimes I think money is part of the problem. Is people want to just buy a quick solution, but that is not what we're talking about. It's this mindset shift. It's this cultural shift that you can't buy your way out of. You have to adapt your way out of it. And so I think that if there's one message, that's it, is get that mindset shift in place so you can start having these conversations. Yes, technology will be part of it. I would argue that technology is step two.
I think part of the reason I was thinking specifics is because the words digital transformation, innovation, they are so general. What does it mean? To me, it had little meaning. It was more surface.
Well, we had a debate. Do we use the word digital transformation in this book and disruption? And we chose to stick with it because we thought if we came up with a new term, nobody would read the book.
Right. And it is buzzword. People are interested in the topics. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we wanted to sell books, let's face it. But I think that's why we come back to the technology fallacy. And that's why I'm growing an appreciation of the title because it's all about if you're thinking about technology first, you're getting it wrong. It's about you need to be thinking people first, organization first, culture first, and technology second. To really sort of it's the business that is broken. Or the business model that is outdated. It's not necessarily the technology that is, although it may be. But getting that first things first is what's important.
That should be plastered all over the book. That last. It's the business model. Well, I'm not sure I saw it right away. Maybe I'm sure it is, but because that kind of sets the framework. Like,
yes, absolutely.
It's almost foundational. We're going to lay this framework and then let's apply the technology, but let's make sure this framework's in place or you'll get all this technology, but no one will adopt it, or it's going to take forever to implement it or change or what have you. I don't know. But back to the free, I just wanted to say this because you have this great thing on duct tape strategy. So you're talking about you don't need a lot of capital expenditures on the technology side. And you have an example that somebody was the way a company used Twitter, which was kind of the digital equivalent of duct tape.
Yeah. So what I want to capitalize on what you just said before we go on to this. So first is, but let's keep in mind, I agree with everything you said, but keep in mind it's also iterative. You start with the people, maybe you implement some technology, figure out what you've learned, start it all over again. So you don't need this big organizational change initiative before you get started or before you do any technology. It's just start working where you can. And so we use the duct tape analogy, to say, is there any one right use for technology? No. Or for duct tape? No. I mean, duct tape can be used, and it was actually fascinating when we researched this chapter, the number of uses for duct tape. The Wikipedia page is fascinating. So they've been used they started fixing, amphibious vehicles in World War II. They've been used to fix helicopter rotors in Vietnam. They're used as a wart remedy that by putting on duct tape and ripping it off is just as effective as some of the over-the-counter medicines on getting rid of warts, which who would have thought to do that? And so is there one right, and you can build, wallets and clothing and all sorts. You can carry water with duct tape if you put it together right. So to say there's one right way of digital technology or of duct tape is ridiculous. Just like saying there's one use of technology that is the right way, because once you put these technologies in place, so start small, because oftentimes you learn uses through your experimentation with them. And if you just do this, I'm not saying you won't eventually need large enterprise-wide investments in technology, but that's certainly not where you should start. You should start with smaller experiments, lighter experiments, so you can figure out what are the business use cases for these things before you ramp up and do this massive change. And for instance, I was talking to the chief digital officer of MetLife, and he had this like 3 to 4 stage scaling process. Experiment, get proof of concept, roll it out to sort of a meso level where you're sort of figuring out if it can actually make sense at scale before you actually say, okay, we're going in this direction. And so it's that process of sort of experimenting, exploring before you make the big bets, that I think is the lesson here.
Jerry, this has been great. Again, the book is The Technology Fallacy, How People Are the Real Key to Digital Transformation. Is it out now?
It was available on Amazon starting yesterday, so the timing is perfect. So it is out now, and it's available at a bookstore near you.
Where can people find you?
Yeah, so my website is www.profkane.com. But usually if you search Gerald Kane, I'm one of the first people to pop up, or Gerald Kane, Boston College at Google. Would love to hear what people think about the book. And if I can help educate some companies or do some workshops, I'd love to hear from those people as well.
You're on Twitter and...
Oh, yes. I've been teaching social media since 2009. So I'm well versed in most platforms.
This is great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. I appreciate the time, and do be in touch.
Well, that is all the time we have today. Please spread the word if you enjoyed the episode. Leave us a review on iTunes and share it with your friends on your favorite social platforms. Big thank you to Sam Williams, my audio guy. Make sure you visit LarryWeeks.com for all my content, and we will talk again soon.